presidential historian Richard Norton Smith is an author of great presidential stories. He is a director of presidential libraries. He is a commentator on places like the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. He is a C-SPAN presence, both on and off screen, and this current series on the presidential libraries is magnificent, and I hope you're enjoying it. He is a friend of the Ford family. He was a distinguished eulogist in January that you no doubt heard. And as I say, he's coming home to West Michigan. We're looking very forward to his talk this morning. Like father, like son, the Adamses of Massachusetts. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Richard Norton Smith.
Thank you, Glees. Good morning, everyone. Thank you. For those of you who were here yesterday, you're obviously gluttons for punishment. Welcome back. I'm delighted to be here, and Glees did not exaggerate. It feels very much like a homecoming. So thank you for making me feel so welcome. We're going to talk about the Adamses, the other Adams family. Although, actually, by the time they're done, they may seem as gloomy as the as the original. You may all remember back in 2001, there were all of these analogies made between the Bushes and the Adamses. You know, before the Bushes and the Kennedys and the Rockefellers and the Tafts, they were the Adamses, the original and some might argue still the most distinguished dynasty in American politics. Anyone who watched Bill Clinton hand the baton on Inauguration Day on to George W. Bush might very well have contrasted the scene with exactly 200 years earlier when John Adams refused to attend the inauguration of his former friend, turned political rival, Thomas Jefferson. For the years thereafter, the first President Adams would nurse his grudges, even as the second sought to avenge his father's much-abused name. You also have probably encountered the fact that 41, as Washington shorthand refers to the first George Bush, routinely refers to his son as 43. It is also said that a justifiably proud father teasingly calls his son Quincy. It is an analogy that has its limits. John Quincy Adams used to rise every morning with the sun to read Tacitus and Cicero. Enough said. Another, however, parallel, people who think that today's politics are ugly and nasty and polarized, all of which is true, they really ought to go back in time. I don't know if it's consoling or maybe it's depressing to think that we haven't come any further in 200 years, but the campaign of 1796, the first Adams campaign, did little to encourage the friends of democracy. Long before the first negative spot hit the nation's airwaves, character assassination was the order of the day, with Thomas Jefferson variously branded a coward, a better philosopher than statesman, and an infidel seduced by France and dusky Sally Hemings. Vice President Adams fared little better. His indiscreet writings about simple men and gentlemen placed in the worst possible light. Still more improbably, the self-righteous Yankee from Quincy got his own taste of sexual innuendo when gossips claimed that George Washington had dispatched American diplomats to France not to secure peace between the young republic and its wartime ally, but to procure a female quartet to gratify the lascivious desires of the president and his second-in-command. For once, Adams laughed off the slander, protesting that by keeping the lovely ladies for himself, the diplomat in question had cheated me out of my due. The Washington presidency ended, of course, on the morning of March 4th, 1797. That morning, Washington, who was a great master of political theater, donned his best black velvet suit and walked to Congress Hall for his last act as president He very deliberately chose to dispense with elaborate coaches of state pulled by 6 milk-white horses. Not so the president-elect, who arrived for his inauguration resplendent in a pearl-colored suit of native broadcloth set off by a dress sword and cockade hat. Now, it looked good on Washington. It really didn't look good on Adams, who was a short, rather squat. I'll never forget, I once introduced David McCullough over at the Ford Museum, and he was talking about Adams as a short, round, red-headed, Yankee, educated. Anyway, I thought it was hitting dangerously close to home. But he said nice things about him, so I suppose. But it's easy to laugh, but that illustrates in some ways actually a serious point. No one knew how to be a president except to emulate George Washington. And the tragedy in some ways of the Adams presidency isn't that he tried to dress like George Washington. He kept George Washington's cabinet, which was a really, really stupid thing to do. Ironically, misplaced deference was to prove Adams' undoing. Why? Well, first of all, these were people whose loyalty was to originally Washington, and for the most part now to Hamilton, not to John Adams. Hamilton is the wire puller behind the scenes, who's pulling the strings, really the boss of the Federalist Party, a president in all but name, certainly in his own mind, and someone who did not like John Adams, did not respect John Adams. The feelings were returned with compound interest. Remember, Adams famously referred to the illegitimate Hamilton as the bastard brat of a Scots peddler, and it went downhill from there. That is very Adams. Prickly, sometimes paranoid, bereft of small talk, and incapable of the white lie or meaningless compliment. John Adams is the modern political handler's nightmare. "I do not say when I was a politician," he exclaimed testily, "for that I never was." Yet if one cannot imagine him taking a poll or listening to a spin doctor, it is not for lack of ambition. All his life, Adams thirsted for reputation while refusing to court the fickle gods of popularity. He is an American paradox, a revolutionary who feared the mob, a provincial who made the world and the world of ideas his home. And he was the original president of the Red Sox nation. He said, in all seriousness, as an adult, that Harvard and our Boston town meetings have set the world in motion. A lot of people in Boston still feel that way. John Adams is a conservative who distrusted banks and loathed financial speculators. He was a deeply spiritual figure who outgrew the frigid doctrines of John Calvin without ever forsaking the even harsher self-demands of a Puritan conscience. He, before the end of his life, believed quite seriously that Unitarianism would one day be the national religion of the American people. At the age of 21, this is how he put it, quote, "Upon common theaters, indeed, the applause of the audience is of more importance to the actor than their own approbation. But upon the stage of life, while conscience claps, let the world hiss." Doesn't sound like a modern politician.